This isn't your class, sweetheart.
This isn't your class, sweetheart. The words dropped like a hammer in the middle of the business class lounge at LAX. Every head in the room turned, every conversation paused. Even the barista behind the marble espresso counter looked up. The voice belonged to Lincoln Vale, billionaire tech CEO, founder of Hyperion Systems, a man who'd made his fortune selling the illusion of connection while living entirely above it. And the target of his mockery? Zahara Bennett. She stood at the entrance, holding nothing more than a simple navy blue carry-on, a boarding pass, and the kind of grace that doesn't need permission to enter a room. Her skin, deep and smooth, glowed beneath the natural lighting. Her eyes, sharp, focused, present. Her curls were pulled into a low, neat bun, and her tailored suit hugged her frame with quiet elegance. She didn't belong, at least not to them. The silence that followed Lincoln's remark said it all. No one came to her defense. A few smirked, some looked away. One man even pulled out his phone to discreetly record. But Zahara didn't move. She didn't lower her gaze, didn't clench her jaw. Instead, she smiled. A slow, warm, almost amused smile, like she knew something the rest of them didn't. And she did. Because the seat next to Lincoln on this 11-hour flight to Geneva? It was hers. This story isn't just about boarding passes or boarding lounges. This is a black story about identity, dignity, and what happens when quiet strength meets loud arrogance. This is the kind of story they don't expect you to survive, let alone rise above. But on Hidden Worth, we believe in telling stories that flip the script, that reveal who people really are when the titles fade and the power plays crumble. So if you've ever been overlooked, judged, or told you don't belong, stick around. What happens next will shake more than just the cabin. And hey, if you're already feeling that fire, tap like, hit follow, and share this moment. Because someone out there needs to hear what's coming. You're watching Hidden Worth. And this is just the beginning. The boarding door slid open, and Zahara stepped from the jet bridge into the cool, curated air of the business class cabin. Every detail was designed for comfort. Cream leather seats, brushed steel fixtures, soft lighting that mimicked a California sunset. But the air felt heavy, as if the room itself had been holding its breath since she appeared in the lounge. A flight attendant with a perfect bun and polished name tag glanced at Zahara's boarding pass, then looked back at her face. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Just confirming," she said, scanning the pass again. "Seat 3 amperes?" Zahara nodded. The attendant hesitated a heartbeat too long before stepping aside. As Zahara walked to her seat, she could feel the looks on her back like static. A man in a gray sports coat lowered his newspaper to study her. A woman in pearls whispered to her seatmate, covering her mouth but not her words. "She must work for somebody," the woman murmured. Another passenger raised an eyebrow at Zahara's carry-on, muttering about priority space, as though it were his personal closet. Lincoln Vale was already seated, his long legs stretched into the aisle like a territorial marker. He glanced up as Zahara approached, then leaned toward the hedge fund manager next to him. "Hope she isn't afraid of altitude or ambition," he said, just loud enough to carry. A few people nearby chuckled, the kind of laugh that sounds like permission. Zahara slid into her seat without a word, arranging her bag under the seat and placing her phone face down on the armrest. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. The calmness in her hands contrasted with the tension around her. She adjusted the air nozzle above her head, feeling the cool flow on her skin. Across the aisle, a social media influencer angled her phone to catch Zahara in the frame of a story. The caption flashed for an instant. "Diversity seating plan?" before disappearing back into filters and hashtags. None of it drew a reaction. Zahara kept her eyes on the window, watching baggage carts move across the tarmac like silent ants. She inhaled once, deep and steady. The plane would lift soon enough, and with it, the assumptions pressed down on her shoulders. For now, she stayed still, her composure a quiet shield against the buzz of prejudice rising like static before a storm. The plane hadn't even lifted off, but judgment was already in the air. It came in whispers, side glances, pauses, just a second too long. A collective language spoken without words, fluent in microaggressions, dressed in designer clothes. Zahara didn't need to look up to know what was happening. She could feel it the way some people feel storms coming just beneath the skin. A A woman in the row ahead reached into her Louis Vuitton tote and pulled out a silk sleep mask, not bothering to hide the way she looked Zahara over before slipping it on like armor. Her husband, adjusting his Rolex, leaned over and said, "It's always the ones who act like they belong that don't." A man across the aisle sipped his whiskey, then muttered, "Wouldn't be surprised if she's flying on someone else's dime." His voice wasn't loud, but it was intentional. Another woman, early 42s, crisp linen blazer, and hair that clearly required a stylist on retainer, leaned across the aisle to her travel partner and said, "I bet she's an Instagram coach or something. They always try to play executive." Her friend laughed, the sound soft and cruel. "Or maybe she won a contest." The chuckles weren't direct. No names were spoken, but the intention was as clear as the fastened seatbelt sign blinking above them. Zahara remained composed, her eyes fixed on the clouds forming outside the window. Her hands were still, her breath steady, but inside, she knew what this was. This wasn't about her seat, or her clothes, or her suitcase. It was about her being black. In this space, unapologetically, and that, for some of them, was more offensive than anything she could have said or done. She heard the faint snap of a photo being taken. Someone, pretending to scroll on their phone, had clearly captured her mid-glance and posted it. The screen tilted just enough to reveal a caption that stung more than the flash ever could. "Wrong flight, right?" The likes were already coming in. Still, Zahara didn't react. She'd learned long ago that sometimes, silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Her phone buzzed gently in her lap. A message from her older sister read, "They're uncomfortable because you're undeniable. Keep your crown on." She smiled to herself, just barely, because what the mob didn't know is that they weren't dealing with someone who needed their approval. They were about to find out what it looks like when quiet strength takes up space. And they weren't ready. Somewhere over the Rocky Mountains, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. Nothing dramatic at first, just a soft bump, a quiet rattle of overhead bins. But in business class, even mild discomfort feels personal. People sat up straighter, napkins were smoothed, drinks clutched tightly. One man rang for a flight attendant just to ask if the turbulence was standard. Zahara didn't move. She glanced out the window, watching the wings flex against the pale sky. Her breathing stayed even, one hand resting on the closed folder in her lap. She looked calm, but not because she didn't know what was happening. She knew exactly what was happening. 2 rows up, Lincoln Vale leaned over to his seatmate, his voice a notch louder than needed. "I just hope our pilot isn't part of some inclusion initiative." He chuckled to himself, swirling his scotch. Though I guess that would explain the bumpy ride. The hedge fund guy next to him gave a quiet laugh. "As long as they don't let the cleaning crew take over mid-flight." Zahara heard it. So did the man across the aisle, who shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. A younger woman, maybe early 30s, AirPods in, laptop open, glanced at Zahara, then looked quickly away. It was the look of someone caught between knowing better and staying silent. Another jolt hit the cabin, not sharp, but enough to rattle ice cubes and egos. The flight attendants paused their service, holding on to carts. Still, Zahara sat unfazed. "She doesn't even flinch," someone whispered. Lincoln smirked. "Of course not. When you don't understand what's going on, you don't know when to be afraid." That line hit harder than the turbulence. But Zahara didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she calmly reached for her water, took a slow sip, and leaned back in her seat. She knew how fragile men like Lincoln were, the kind who confuse loudness with leadership, who build empires on arrogance and mistake prejudice for power. Let them talk, let them assume. Because what they didn't realize was that the person they were mocking wasn't just another passenger. She was the reason this flight was still in the air. The tension in the cabin wasn't just from the turbulence anymore. It was something else, heavier, growing, and it was about to shift. The seatbelt sign pinged softly overhead. A flight attendant passed by with a tray of drinks, her hands steady despite the occasional jolt from above. The cabin had quieted, but it wasn't peace, it was a kind of tension that hums under the surface, the kind that brews when something big is coming, but no one wants to name it. Then the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered an unexpected situation requiring immediate protocol review." We kindly ask that all passengers remain seated. At this time, we request the assistance of Miss Zahara Bennett, seated in 3 amperes, to join us in the cockpit. Every neck turned. Every conversation stopped. And for a moment, just a breath, no one said anything. Then came the whispers. Did he say her name? That Zahara? No way. Why would the captain need her? Lincoln blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The hedge fund guy leaned forward. Wait, she's part of the crew? A woman with diamond earrings muttered. What kind of flight is this? The influencer's phone stopped mid-scroll. But Zahara, she just reached down, unbuckled her seatbelt with a quiet click, and stood. No rush, no fear. She gave a quick nod to the attendant now standing by her seat, then stepped into the aisle. And the thing was, she didn't say a word. She didn't need to, because suddenly, silence was speaking for her. She walked past the rows of passengers who had judged her outfit, her presence, her silence. Past the smirks, the whispered comments, the filtered photos meant to shame her. She passed Lincoln, whose smirk had faded completely. As she moved toward the front, some passengers leaned out to get a better look, like they were witnessing a twist in a movie they didn't see coming. Others sat frozen, trying to piece it all together. The curtain to the cockpit opened, and the co-pilot appeared, nodding with familiarity. Right this way, ma'am. Zahara stepped through without hesitation, the curtain closing behind her like a page turning. Back in the cabin, the whispers started again. But this time, they were different. Who is she? Why did the captain call her? What's going on? Lincoln sat back in his seat, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. Because deep down, he already knew. The storm he'd laughed at was real. And it just entered the cockpit. The cockpit was silent when Zahara stepped in, except for the steady hum of instruments and the soft blip of the radar. The captain turned in his seat. His expression was calm but serious, the kind of face that had seen years of crisis and knew how to move through it. Miss Bennett, he said, standing and offering his seat. We have a situation. Zahara nodded once, already reading the instruments. Unidentified aircraft on parallel path? The co-pilot's eyes widened just a little. You saw it? Caught the ping through the international satellite handoff. It's not squawking ID, and the last update came from our regional handoff an hour ago. She spoke like she belonged there. Because she did. Zahara Bennett wasn't just another passenger. She was a senior-level advisor for the International Aviation Risk and Threat Response Council, IARTRC for short. She'd helped write the same protocols being followed on this very flight. What she didn't post on social media, what she never wore on her sleeve, was that she was the person governments called when flight paths went dark or threats circled above the clouds. The captain gave a small nod. They haven't responded to 3 separate hails. We've logged it. Waiting on NATO directive. Zahara slid into the jump seat and picked up the headset. Her voice was clear, firm, but calm as she relayed coordinates, confirmed transponder gaps, and requested satellite overlay. She didn't flinch, didn't fumble. In less than 3 minutes, she had decoded what others would have missed entirely. It's not hostile, she said, leaning back. It's a disabled drone running redundant loop, likely rerouted from a military training zone. No threat, but close enough to trigger alerts. We'll adjust vector by 0.7 to avoid overlap. The captain let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Copy that. And, thank you. Zahara handed back the headset, stood, and smoothed her blazer. Glad to help. Keep me updated if it deviates again. And with that, she turned, walked out, and stepped back into the cabin, now quiet, eyes wide, mouths shut. No one dared say a word. Not yet. But the atmosphere had changed. The assumptions that hung heavy in the air had shattered like cheap glass. Because the woman they dismissed had just helped steer the entire plane clear of a potential threat. And she hadn't raised her voice once. Lincoln sat stiffly in his seat, eyes locked on Zahara as she passed. This wasn't just a twist. It was the beginning of a reckoning. When Zahara stepped back into the cabin, everything felt different. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed. They no longer floated on mockery. Now, they carried confusion, caution, curiosity. Passengers who once rolled their eyes now stared like they were trying to solve a puzzle. The woman with the pearl earrings sat up straighter, adjusting her scarf. The man with the business journal lowered it slowly, watching Zahara with narrowed eyes like he was rereading a paragraph he'd completely misunderstood. She returned to her seat without a sound, buckled her belt, and calmly placed her folder back into her carry-on. The same bag someone had sneered at earlier. Now, no one dared look at it with disdain. The influencer across the aisle lowered her phone. Her screen was dark. For once, no story to share. Lincoln Vale cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. He glanced at Zahara, then quickly looked away. The cocky grin he wore earlier? Gone. Replaced by something tight and uncertain. "Did you know who she was?" a man whispered behind his hand. "No, but she walked into that cockpit like she owned the sky." "I think she does," someone else muttered. One by one, the voices softened. The giggles faded. No more jokes about charity seats or diversity quotas. No more sneers about clothes or skin color. Now, it was reverence, quiet, hesitation, and under it all shame. Because they hadn't just misjudged her. They'd misjudged themselves. Zahara didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence had always been power, and now it echoed louder than any insult ever could. The flight attendant who had hesitated at the boarding gate earlier returned, her demeanor different this time. She placed a warm towel on Zahara's tray with a gentle smile. "Let us know if you need anything, Miss Bennett." Zahara met her gaze, gave a single gracious nod. No arrogance, no payback. Just grace. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't explode. It whispered. And that whisper said, "You were wrong. You judged too soon. You assumed too much." Now they were left sitting in that realization, 30,000 feet above the ground, strapped in with nowhere to go. And Zahara? She leaned back in her seat, took a slow breath, and looked out the window not to escape them, but to remind herself that the sky was wide, the world bigger than any box they tried to put her in. They had tried to shrink her. Instead, she expanded. Lincoln Vale tried to reclaim the silence with confidence. But it didn't work. He shifted in his seat, crossed his legs, uncrossed them, then adjusted his cufflinks, an expensive twitch, meant to remind everyone he still ran billion-dollar deals and had private jets waiting on tarmacs. But none of that mattered now. Because power doesn't live in clothing or titles. Not when the whole cabin has seen what real composure looks like. And Zahara had just redefined it. Lincoln leaned toward the hedge fund guy across the aisle. "She's probably just a consultant," he whispered, the edge of desperation creeping into his voice. "One of those mid-level analysts, looks bigger than it is." The man didn't respond. In fact, he looked down at his watch, like time itself had turned on Lincoln. The woman with the diamond earrings gave a dry cough, then turned away, pretending to search for gum in her purse. Olivia Lincoln's executive assistant, who had been quietly reading emails, suddenly looked very interested in the emergency landing instructions in the seat back pocket. The power Lincoln had walked onto the plane with, the swagger, the dominance, the assumed control was cracking. Fast. Because everyone knew now. He had laughed the loudest, mocked the hardest, and judged the deepest. And he had done it publicly, while the woman he tore down kept calm, kept quiet, and saved their flight. The worst part? He knew it. His phone buzzed on the armrest. A notification lit up. Davenport Group mentioned in ongoing federal investigation, SEC and IARTRC sources confirmed. Zahara's agency. Lincoln's face went pale. He snatched up the phone, scrolling furiously, reading headlines that hadn't existed an hour ago. Terms like financial misconduct, offshore laundering, and insider trading leapt off the screen. Passengers around him began to notice. One man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "That's the guy. That's Lincoln Vale." A woman in a navy blouse nodded. He was bragging about his hedge fund an hour ago. Zahara sat quietly, eyes closed, as if she hadn't just turned his entire world upside down by simply doing her job. The flight attendant approached again, not with champagne, but with quiet urgency. "Mr. Vale," she said, lowering her voice. "You'll need to remain on board upon landing. Federal agents will be meeting the plane." And just like that, the altitude wasn't the only thing dropping. Lincoln sat back, chest tight, hands frozen. This time, no one laughed. And Zahara? She hadn't said a single word to him. She didn't have to. His fall was loud enough for everyone to hear. By the time the flight began its descent, The air in business class had thickened, not from turbulence, but from reckoning. No one dared look Zahara in the eye, not directly. Yet every glance still drifted toward her, as if drawn by gravity. People who had once mocked her with whispers now sat weighed down by their own. The woman with the pearl earrings shifted in her seat, then slowly turned. "Miss Bennett," she began, voice thin. I hope you'll accept my apologies. I didn't realize." Zahara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She simply turned her gaze back to the window, watching the clouds thin as the land approached. Another passenger, a man in a monogrammed blazer, spoke next. "You handled everything with real poise. I just wanted to say. Respect." Still, Zahara said nothing. It wasn't coldness, it was clarity. When you've been doubted, dismissed, and disrespected for no reason beyond your skin, your silence becomes a shield. Her silence now wasn't passive, it was powerful. It reminded everyone that her worth had never depended on their recognition. The influencer across the aisle, who had once tried to make Zahara a punchline, quietly deleted her story. No follow-up post, no apology shared with followers. Just a deep, visible discomfort as her phone sat untouched in her lap. Zahara noticed, but again, she said nothing. Lincoln Vale hadn't moved in 10 minutes. He stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, hands resting like dead weight on the tray table. All the confidence he'd flown in with had drained from his face, replaced with something raw, fear. Not of Zahara, but of being seen through. Because now, everyone saw who he really was. Zahara didn't gloat. She didn't smile, didn't raise an eyebrow. She didn't lean over and whisper, "I told you so." She just existed, unshaken, undiminished. That alone was her vindication. Her silence carried more weight than their apologies, because while their opinions had once tried to define her, they now said more about them than they ever did about her. She had been right to walk with grace, right to not explain herself, right to take up space. And now, the entire cabin, once loud with judgment, sat in reverent quiet. The seatbelt sign chimed on. The captain's voice returned to announce their final descent. Zahara leaned back, one hand resting gently on her carry-on. She didn't look like someone who had just won. She looked like someone who never needed to prove herself in the first place. The wheels touched down on the tarmac with a soft bump, and the cabin exhaled as one. Some passengers clapped lightly, a reflex more than celebration. But no one looked at Lincoln. No one dared glance at Zahara too long either. The silence that had followed her still hovered, patient and full. As the plane taxied to the gate, a quiet voice broke the air. "Excuse me, Miss Bennett." Zahara turned slowly. It was the young flight attendant, the same one who had looked uncomfortable earlier when the first-class passengers had mocked her. Her name tag read, Marina. Her posture was different now, shoulders back, eyes direct. "I just wanted to say thank you," Marina said, her voice more confident than before. "Not just for what you did in the cockpit, but for how you held yourself out here." Zahara studied her for a moment, then gave a soft nod. "You don't know how many times I've had to swallow comments like theirs," Marina continued, glancing subtly toward the rows behind them. "But watching you, it made me feel like I didn't have to anymore. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a confession." Zahara's expression softened. She reached out and lightly touched Marina's arm. "You matter too," she said. "Never let people make you smaller to feel taller." Marina's eyes misted, but she smiled. That exchange, small as it was, rippled through the row. A businessman nearby, who had stayed quiet the entire flight, gave Zahara a respectful nod. The older woman with the navy scarf, who had judged her in silence, now looked away with something like remorse. One act of solidarity, one moment of quiet courage. That's all it took to shift the air again. Zahara zipped up her bag, stood slowly, and turned toward the exit. Marina stepped forward, instinctively shielding her from any lingering stares as she helped clear the aisle. As Zahara walked down the narrow space between the seats, another passenger, the woman in a gray pantsuit, who hadn't said a word the entire flight, spoke softly. "We needed to see that, thank you." Zahara didn't break stride. She just nodded gently, offering the woman a soft, knowing smile. And suddenly, Zahara wasn't just the woman who'd been mocked, or even the one who saved the plane. She was the mirror, the reminder, the standard. The unexpected ally didn't need a title or a rank. She needed only to speak up. And Zahara, she gave her permission to. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand still in your truth and let others catch up. The aircraft door hissed as it opened to the jet bridge, and sunlight spilled in, flooding the cabin with a harsh clarity. Zahara waited calmly in the aisle, her carry-on in hand, when the cockpit door opened behind her. Captain Reynolds stepped out. His presence was quiet but commanding, the kind of authority built over decades in the sky. His uniform was crisp, his posture steady. He scanned the cabin, pausing for just a moment. Then he spoke not to the crew, not to the tower, but directly to the passengers. "I've flown this route for over 20 years, he began, voice low and steady. "And in all my time, I've learned that storms aren't always visible. Some of them sit in the cabin, in silence, in judgment." People shifted in their seats, the tension crawling back. "But today," he continued, "you were all lucky enough to witness something rare." His eyes settled on Zahara. "You sat near a woman who could have dismantled this entire flight with a few words. She didn't. You underestimated someone who holds more power in her quiet grace than any of us do in our ranks." Whispers rose behind them. No one expected this. "She wasn't here as a passenger," he said, raising his voice just enough. "She was here as the top international advisor on aviation security. The very person who ensures people like you arrive safely at destinations you take for granted." Lincoln Vale sank deeper into his seat, staring at the floor, his empire dissolving by the second. Captain Reynolds paused, then, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mr. Vale, we'll be escorting you off the plane momentarily. You'll be met by federal agents. I suggest you do not resist." Gasps fluttered across the cabin. The once silent Olivia clutched her tablet like a shield, eyes wide. "Let this serve as a reminder," the captain said, now addressing everyone. "That status does not equal character. That appearance does not reflect worth, and that power, real power, doesn't always wear a suit." He gave Zahara a nod of deep respect, not performative, not for show. Real. Zahara inclined her head slightly in return, her face calm, her chin lifted, her silence still intact. Captain Reynolds turned to the crew. "Clear the aisle." As Zahara stepped forward toward the exit, the passengers watched not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. No more whispered insults. No more side eyes. Just the heavy weight of truth landing like a final blow. She didn't look back. She never needed to, because when you carry yourself in truth, you never walk alone. When Zahara stepped off that plane, there was no red carpet, no flashing cameras, no news crews waiting to capture the moment. And yet, it was one of the most powerful exits anyone on that flight would ever witness. Because sometimes, the loudest legacy is left in silence. Let's talk about what really happened up there. Zahara didn't win because she exposed Lincoln Vale. She didn't win because federal agents were waiting for him at the gate. She didn't win because people apologized half-hearted or otherwise. She won because she never gave them the power to define her in the first place. Her presence was the protest. Her grace was the resistance. And her silence? That was her shield. See, when you're a black woman or anyone who's ever been marginalized, you learn early on that not every room is built for you. Some spaces weren't designed with you in mind. And when you show up, heads turn, eyes narrow, voices whisper. But what Zahara reminded us is this: you still show up anyway. You show up with your head high and your heart whole. Not because you're trying to prove your place, but because your place was never up for debate. This story isn't just about racism on a plane. It's about every invisible fight people carry with them every day. The assumptions, the dismissals, the quiet humiliations that stack up until they threaten to break you. But Zahara didn't break. She didn't flinch. She didn't perform for anyone's approval. She held her truth. She stood in her name. She stayed rooted in her power. And in doing so, she gave every person watching a mirror. Some saw themselves, some saw their mistakes, but no one walked away unchanged. So, if you've ever been the only one who looked like you in the room, if you've ever been the one laughed at, dismissed, or judged before you ever said a word, this story is yours too. And we want to hear it. Drop a comment below. Tell us your Zahara moment. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that quiet strength is still strength. This is hidden worth, where the underestimated become unforgettable. And if this story moved you, follow, stay with us. Because we've got more stories coming. Stories that reveal the truth people are too afraid to tell. And remember, your story has value. Your presence has power. And no one can take that away from you.